Our first speaker here today is Orit Halpern, and she's the Lighthouse Professor and Chair of Digital Cultures and Societal Change at the Technische Universität Dresden, which is a new position she's taken up. And we're very sorry that we didn't manage to get that into the program, but this is before this she was based at the Concordia University in Montreal at the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And we invited Orit for several reasons. One is that we keep returning to Beautiful Data, the book she published back in 2015, I think. And this sort of underlying cybernetic reason and the affective aspects of data, which has been very useful and has already been brought up here in other presentations. But we're also very interested and very curious about her later work on the Smartness mandate, which, as far as I understand, is looking at smartness not as a technology, but as an epistemology, and which is the subject of a forthcoming book that will be published later this year, I think, co-written with Robert Mitchell at MIT, published at MIT Press. And the Smartness mandate will figure in a talk here today, I think, as well, as the title of the talk is The Smartness Mandate, Theorizing Our Nervous Present. Very welcome, Orit.
Thank you all for being here. So I changed the title a little bit. This is indeed excerpted from my forthcoming book, The Smartness Mandate, which is coming out this spring, or no, this December, actually, from MIT Press. And this is partially stuff from this book and also stuff that I'm working on in the future. And I want to add that I'm really sorry today I'm not talking about the environment at all, but a big part of the book is actually about resilience as part of the logic of smartness. But today I'm actually going to talk not about, well, I often am known to have worked on smart cities such as Songdo in South Korea. One of the givens very often is that smart cities have a relationship somehow to neoliberal reason and governance. In this talk, I'm not going to talk about any cities, actually, but I am going to talk about my current preoccupation, which is largely between finance and the alt-right. And I'm increasingly interested in histories of the history of automated or non-conscious decision-making, its relationship to finance and economy, and to democracy. So that's one major component of my future work. So without further ado, I apologize for the lack of cities, but like I said, smartness is an epistemology and an ideology, so we're kind of also trying to think about the things that are underpinning contemporary logics. And I think this will have a lot to say actually to the morning session. But just to begin, in 1945, the economist Friedrich Hayek began his battle on behalf of neoliberalism with a call to rethink knowledge. In an essay that looms large over the history of contemporary conservative and libertarian economic thought, Hayek inaugurated a new concept of the market. The market is a rational economic order that is based or deals with the question that knowledge never exists. The economic problem of society is one of data, and it is a problem of the utilization of knowledge not given to anyone in its totality. This was no small claim. When situated within the broader context of Hayek's engagements with the sciences and technologies of his time, this seemingly theoretical statement gestures to a grand aspiration, a fervent dream for a new world governed by data. At the heart of Hayek's conception of a market was the idea that no single subject, mind, or central authority has complete knowledge of the world. Such proposals might appear at first as unintuitive responses to political catastrophe. Hayek was a fierce critic of both fascism and communism. His argument concerning the uses of knowledge was in direct response to what he viewed as a violent political crisis created by democratic populism. His response, unlike that of many cultural critics of the time, was not, however, to buffer the support for a reasonable, liberal human subject, but rather to imagine the replacement of human reason through distributed intelligence and the technology of the market. This emerging neoliberal imaginary did not operate in isolation. As historians of science have noted, the Cold War rationality did not conform to the dictates of Enlightenment reason. The specter of technologically induced planetary destruction through nuclear war and the memory of global war, World War II, created a critique of human decision-making. This critique fostered the production of formal, repeatable, and algorithmic models of decision-making, perhaps embodied by places such as Rand with the game theory and the effort to kind of rationalize and technicize human thought, one that perhaps mirrored the emerging new computer technologies of the time. But if the rational decision maker was still an expert in area studies or science, the intelligence Hayek proposed, I argue, was somewhat different. The rational technocrat was capable of objectivity, planning, and predicting the future. The subjective and ignorant figure Hayek provides us with does not. Almost simultaneously, economists, psychologists, and technologists, so Hayek was not alone in proposing this, and while I'm using him as kind of like an or speaker, so to speak, within the American context, or an or form. These kind of statements came from many, many places. Hayek's work, in fact, was informed by the work of psychologist Donald Hebb's work on neural networks, which I will soon talk about. And then Hayek went on, actually, to inform the work of Frank Rosenblatt, who actually built the first operating neural network. And I'm going to discuss these links and ask questions about how this underpinning new epistemology coming out of the 50s and 60s continues to inform contemporary smart ideas of smartness, including perhaps those of smart cities. So becoming neural. So I'm going to begin with psychology, actually, not economics. Always better time. So in 1948, psychologist, McGill-based psychologist Donald Olding Hebb published The Organization of Behavior, one of the most famous books ever in psychology, according to many, many authorities. It was a connectionist account that argued, basically, that cells, or neurons that wire together, fire together. That is to say that what is stored in a brain, the contents of our perceptions, our cognitive activities, are not the result of some infinite database. There's no Freudian unconscious here, but rather that certain stimuli trigger networked pathways that collaboratively create an action of thought or behavior. The more they're triggered together, the more they fire. So, for example, this glass of water. Throughout my life, I've been trained to see glasses, I guess. What is being stored, I don't have a picture of every glass in my brain, right? But it's that certain types of stimuli, parameters, trigger certain neurons to fire in a pattern. The more they get triggered, the more they get trained. So there's a statistical feature, right? There's a greater probability they will fire when seeing this, the more they have been exposed to this. But it also means that they can be reprogrammed, right? In theory, if brains are like this, maybe they're neuroplastic. If this sounds familiar, it's because this is also the model for contemporary neural network deep learning in machines. So networks kind of learn and they get increasingly weighed. So memory, this type of memory here is about circuits that are statistically determined. The more a pattern triggers, the more it will trigger in the future. It learns. So brains are programmable, perhaps, one might imagine, like machines. But they're also plastic, right? So you can retrain them. And he was really interested in wartime. Obviously, a lot of people had injuries and how people were retraining or addressing disabilities that resulted from the war. And his now famous sensory deprivation study is illustrative of this new neuroplastic or reprogrammable world. While this research has gained infamy as the progenitor of soft torture in the CIA, its initial goal was far more banal. It was to examine the monotony of contemporary work environments and their impacts on attention. Radar operators and other people working in the newly electronic workplace were known to suffer extreme boredom, inattention, and depression. So to test the monotony of this modern work environment, so the US military funded this research, 22 male students were put in a setup like this, designed to induce what they called perceptual isolation. So their ears were plugged, their eyes were blocked, they were kind of bound up in the soft stuff, so suppose you didn't really feel anything. And it's really interesting here that essentially the experimental theory correlated the increase of electronic data with sensory deprivation. I might extrapolate that implicitly boredom and information overload were assumed to be related, which is to say too much data given in certain environments might be the same as no data at all. Needless to say, And while they were lying there, occasionally they would be streamed in like subliminal messages, and these were mostly scientists. But by the end of the study, many participants appeared to believe in ghosts, the supernatural, and no one lasted more than 4 days. And here's some images from a journal just showing what people described that they saw while lying there with their head kind of self-firing their own things, and squirrels. It's Canada. So anyway, this is the kind of thing. By the end, many participants seemed to believe in ghosts, the supernatural. No one lasted more than 4 days in this condition. The study appeared to, they literally had psychotic breakdowns. The study appeared to demonstrate a way to impact people's thinking without ever touching their bodies. It appeared that brains could be remotely programmed to see or think things through suggestion and environmental manipulation of data. Hebb himself called it torture, an observation that found concrete realization in the CIA's Cold War interrogation. Of course, this is the start for the shock doctrine. Naomi Klein discusses this at length. What these studies developed was a new understanding of cognition as scalable, enhanceable, programmable, and environmental, right? The environment impacts the brain. So there's kind of an externalization of the psyche here. After the study, debates have raged over whether participants suffered from too little data or too much. The sounds and stimulus, the containment are also potentially forms of stimulus. For psychologists, though, and an army of trainers after Hebb, information overload increasingly became the norm and an expectation. So it's quite amazing how a few years later, this moves from being a traumatic and torturous experience to actually being maybe something we even welcome or desire in a series of later things. So, for example, witness the rise of training regimens for the shocks of contemporary life aimed at teaching the subject to concentrate and manage and filter excess data, now labeled stress, such as yoga, immersion tanks, self-care, and apps for sleep, concentration, and mindfulness, all which supposedly arise from Hebb's research. So again, this shift from kind of this being a pathology to kind of a management situation. What had been torture was increasingly understood as the very condition for contemporary electronically mediated life, and learning to manage that pain became the essence of survival, preferably through conditioning attention in the senses. And of course, I do want to say, of course, not all bodies are treated the same in this, and there still is like actual torture, and that's, maybe you consider yoga torture, but it really isn't. Which brings us, though, to neural markets. For cyberneticians, psychologists, and soon economists, the idea of an ecologically networked cognition could be a way to reconceive how trauma is dealt with, whether at individual or perhaps social scales. So soon thereafter, Hayek, largely citing Hebb, he really constantly mentions him in the course of this book, in 1952 introduces his model of cognition and mind. In this account, Hayek posited a mind that was linked relationally to the environment, but where perception and cognition were separated in time. So what we call mind is a particular order of a set of events taking place in some manner related to, but not identical with, the physical order of the events in the environments. There's not a one-to-one correlation between cognition and the external world. So the mind is subjective. If fundamentally it does not know the outside world perfectly, there's processes that intervene. This paradigm posits cognition as the direct result of psychological processes that manifest in a temporal neural order. And he goes on to say, the phenomena that we're concerned with here is under the heading of discrimination. This term is somewhat misleading because it suggests a sort of recognition of physical differences, but rather we're concerned with a process which creates the distinctions in questions. The same is true of most other available words: to sort out, to differentiate, or to classify. For Hayek, the world is not comprised of clearly discriminating things nor of recognizable entities. That's not to say, I'm here, you are here. It is to say that there is a relationship, and the point of a cognitive processing is to create discrimination. Recognition or distinctions. Those distinctions don't exist beforehand. And we can think here about discussions more generally about discrimination and difference in AI, and I'm going to come back to that. So minds, like markets, can never be fully calculated, even as their physical and environmental conditioning makes individual cognition subjective and limited. So it's really important that everything is a process, nothing is constantly stable, and you can't know it beforehand. It's relational. And above all, the mind is subjective, so no one can be objective. This brings us, and this, I was thinking about this through Jayton, your talk. This brings us to the question of what would the state be. By deduction, we might also understand this brain, and perhaps by extension the state, as having largely the function as a repository or archive of these apparatuses of classification or models for construction. States thus serve only the function, according to Hayek, of being an archival repository of processes or classes upon which the self-organizing system might emerge. So one could say maybe the state is a platform that simply provides the kind of base algorithms for this kind of self-generating, or an archive, if you will, of processes. And he went on to kind of really affirm that, and we discovered that many of the institutions on which human achievements rest have risen, are functioning without a designing and directing mind, and that their spontaneous collaboration of free man creates things which are greater than their individual minds can ever fully comprehend. So the state's only job is to serve as an infrastructure to allow these self-organizing relations to develop, to spontaneously create more than a part. In this account, human institutions are not designed. They emerge as the result of accumulating processes over time. Markets and human minds had spontaneous, emergent properties that made them resistant to socialized planning, of course. And while Hayek initially deferred from making direct analogies between minds and markets, by 1977, he quite clearly makes them equivalent, that each member neuron or buyer or seller is behaving in a not even conscious manner. A price and market system is, in a sense, a system of communication. Hayek's account captured the idea that intelligence is networked, and more importantly, that a market's function is not to match supply and demand, but rather to aid in the processing of information. More critically, increasingly, the idea of democratic or free order in this account takes on the formation of a networked intelligence operating purposefully, so there's evolution and change, but not consciously, through the model of a communication system for which price is but one type. As scholars have noted, however, Hayek faced increasing challenges to his theories as the democratic collapse neoliberals had imagined happening in the UK and USA after the war never really occurred. To support the ideology of free markets, as a road to freedom, Hayek increasingly therefore turned to theories of systems of emergence in biology and cybernetics. So you see an increasing kind of technicization of kind of this economic discourse to kind of buffer the fact that that collapse that neoliberals and the Mont Pelerin Society had a forecast isn't happening. These models offered a concept of systems as capable of purposeful evolution without direction, and created a language by which to imagine systems whose capacity for change and adaptation would come through the internal mechanisms of feedback and reflexivity. So if only we could turn to more data and more analytics as kind of a mode of self-regulation, that could compensate for political oversight and actual planning in this projection. When viewed within the context of Hayek's life work, the revolutions in his thought are manifold. So just to kind of repeat what Hayek kind of symbolizes, because he's not alone doing this, by the way, and there's great work by people like Philip Murawski on this. First, he argues that obviously markets are about coordinating information, not matching supply and demand. Second, it's a new model of agency, and or should we call it the agent, replacing, if we will, a subject, where the model of learning and using knowledge is grounded in the idea of a networked intelligence, for which the market is supposedly the earth farm. And it's also what I call an environmental intelligence. Markets can allow the creation of knowledge outside and beyond the purview of individual humans. The notion of cognition and decision making that's kind of out there in the world and possessed by entities outside of individuals. This brings us to machines. So the market, the infamous neoliberal Milton Friedman famously stated, is, and I quote, an engine, not a camera. But if it is an engine, what form of machine would it be? In 1956, at a famous workshop at Dartmouth College, or 1955, sorry, a year later, they labeled a new concept, artificial intelligence. And one model that was one person who attended that conference and soon thereafter built this model aspired not to be about representation. So unlike Minsky, unlike many of the people who were approaching it through grammar and linguistics and attempting to lay out the rules, but rather this sort of machine would work like the market and itself be a machine. The model was the process of learning, Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron. So Rosenblatt, in his initial paper, surprisingly does not call on any of the cyberneticians or communication theorists or anyone you would expect, but rather says a small number of people, Hebb, Hayek, Eccles, have set up the descriptive models which might suggest the future of machine learning. Or actually of how we might think of mind, because actually Rosenblatt wanted to find out how human minds work by running these kind of little experimental tests. Whereas earlier models of the neural net and cybernetic intelligence insisted upon the idea of a singular and isolated individual, this model fundamentally rested upon the assumption that intelligence must emerge from the actions of multiple agents and not merely isolated machines. So these are basically, this was the predecessor to neural networks of the present. I can give like a little example. Soon thereafter, Oliver Selfridge developed the Pandemonium project in 59, sorry. And it's basically the first working perceptron. And essentially what it is that each neuron is essentially a logic gate. It says true or false, yes or no, to a basic answer. And the clusters of these get it's put into what he called daemons in this particular model. And so you have one that goes out, and the first model that worked was an oral character recognition. It was a character recognition program. So it went out and gets a letter. That's the stimulus that's coming in. It brings it in. The next net is, say, has the parameter of saying yes or no or screaming. That's why it was called Pandemonium, like, true, there's a straight line. Being quiet if there's not. So certain parts of the net, obviously with an A, will get much louder. Each system continues to make these little small decisions, true, false, straight, or not, until a final decision making tries to decide according to the statistical proportion of screams, true or false, which letter it is. If this is a supervised learning situation, you would compare it with what you put in and then go back to the start and try to reweigh the weights of each network to work out. So that's a basic exemplar, but that's pretty much what many, many systems do today as well. So intelligence here only emerges at the level of the population and through patterns of interaction through the neurons. And as my co-author Rob has noted, it is precisely because perceptrons require training data that they can in principle be trained on population level experience. Though each human individual is limited to a specific set of external stimuli to which he or she is in fact exposed, a computer perceptron can, by contrast, draw on the data of the results of the judgments and experiences, right, of not just one individual, but rather large populations of individuals. So this is a massive reformulation, again, of the model of intelligence. In fact, the early ones didn't work because there wasn't enough data. And one of the reasons that these systems started to work in the late 80s and 90s is because we had the big data sets. I emphasize also the notions here of evolution and probability in the thought of both economists and technologists, because for both, such notions of learning forward ideas that systems might change and adapt non-consciously. So the really important part of this net is that it's an effort. You don't have to tell the computer what an A is. You can get past representation. That's the fantasy. We never have to represent the model to the world. It's just going to kind of learn, just like a baby's brain learns. So there's this entropic. I have no other way of showing statistical instability except random walk, little bouncing balls, but just bear with me. So calculating each individual component, therefore, will not predict the act of the entire system. The hope being that these small operations might culminate in producing more sophisticated thoughts while evading the problem of actually having to describe or represent the solution. While this is not truly possible, the contradictory need to evade representation continues to fuel our desire for unsupervised learning in nets and the agglomeration of ever larger data sets. The data would, in theory, drive the thought. Furthermore, when situated in relationship to Hayek's ideal of economy as the most and perhaps only route to human freedom, we can trace the rise of a broader ideology that identified the flow of information and its coordination as the necessary infrastructure for human freedom, liberty, and equality, all terms he uses interchangeably. Since for Hayek, freedom from coercion is the only freedom that could be called liberty, and coercion equated with all attempts to impose upon a society a deliberately chosen pattern of distribution, we can deduce suggests that any forced effort to produce particular populations or data distributions, i.e., for example, forcing integration or reallowing wealth to different populations, reallocating wealth according to a plan, would also equate with a challenge to human liberty and freedom. And I'm not showing because, of course, it's really important to recall these models are becoming incredibly popular in the wake of civil rights and post-civil rights United States context. So there's a kind of race warfare underpinning actually the popularity of these models, and builds a kind of big conversation about exactly where race sits in AI. So any sort of effort to do these things would also equate with a challenge in this sort of ideology with to human liberty and freedom. While Hayek can be interpreted as allowing for the possibility that redistributing wealth or healthcare might be necessary conditions to enable individuals to exercise non-coerced choices in the market, what might be labeled freedom, neoliberal discourse focused instead on asserting the seemingly natural and never calculatable nature of market processes, thus rendering any form of pre-planning or redistribution of resources or services as endangering the very possibility of evolution, and by derivation terminating the possibility of any future but a repetitive present. And in fact, you also see at the exact same time a kind of technicization in the fantasy of planning. This is an urban dynamics book by Jay Forrester. It also helped with a limits to growth report. So you're kind of, this tension would come to play out critically in fantasies of envisioning feedback and increasing flow of data as seeming solutions to these impasses in democratic political orders at the time. However, there are some problems in this model, but thankfully. But the very feature that made such systems evolutionary and emergent were also their terminal points of failure. The stochastic property of nets lent to unpredictability and potential increases in entropy. And these were very long-running concerns in the cybernetic sciences. On the other hand, neural networks researchers and theoreticians found two remaining and inseparable problems. One concerned excess data, and the second adaptability or plasticity. If human brains could be trained, how did human beings maintain their stability in the face of environmental stresses? Remember, like everyone had a breakdown in this study. How did nets know if they're being trained on errors, for example, if you're feeding back an error or manipulated? In short, how do you know if a signal, since we now have this open brain to environment, everything's the market, if it's coming from within or without the net, and from when? And if a system is always adapting, how does it not mutate to the point of extinction or psychosis? Neural network researchers quickly discovered that errors in weighting might propagate or exacerbate errors throughout the entire system, right? And positive feedback might lead to oscillation and instability. Much of the perceptron model is dedicated, and particularly in the present, the success of this is by trying to fix these things through back propagation. Neural network researchers only refracted a broader discourse repeated by cyberneticians, political scientists, social scientists, and economists. What if network feedback loops fed the wrong positive feedback, for example, a nuclear confrontation, leading to network instability and by proxy, social and even terminal failure? So how do you know if it's true or false, if it's right or wrong, what you're doing? In the post-World War period, economists also obsessed about how to avoid the sort of market failures, shocks, if we will, that led to the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe after the First World War. Within the context of the Cold War, such historical memories of market failure came adjoined with new concerns about the future survival of democratic and socialist societies. The question, however, was about decision-making. Were populations sound decision-makers? A history of populist democratic fascism and rabid anti-communism might suggest otherwise. Richard Hofstadter's path-breaking analysis of Senator McCarthy's anti-communism stands out in this regard. The paranoid style, this is what Hofstadter labeled, he argued at the time, understands the world in terms of patterns of behavior among different targeted groups, overstating the possibility of prediction and control of the future. So people see patterns everywhere, which kind of conversely leads to kind of a fantasy of being able to control that by like eliminating whatever enemy you've kind of created in your mind. In short, too much data might also provide ecological fallacies and false pattern, something that begins to hint at where these neural nets and alt-right politics might have a relationship. However, such paranoias provoked problems for the concept of the invisible hands. Economists, like technocrats, had to provide new concepts for decision-making that might evade the determinism of conspiracy, but still legitimate the purported democracy of the market. So if the self-organizing market kind of creates its own patterns, how do you know if it's like the free market or the deep state, to use QAnon's current thing? So you have a problem, right? Like, if there's any, is the true order from the nature or the nature of the market, or is it a false order from some subversive forces? So you clearly have an issue here. So to summate, this new concept of an intelligence, this autopoietic, self-organizing, and cybernetic, found itself caught in the problem of what would happen if all the messages being circulated were false or noise. And the two now were not very clearly separated in communication theory. But what would truth be? What we might find surprising, however, is that this seeming terminal problem, this real vexing issue for psychologists and economists in the 50s, by the 80s has become a virtue. So at the height of the introduction of algorithmic trading and derivative instruments to the market, computer scientists turned financial guru Fisher Black, who was Minsky's student and a real fan of Hayek, one of the creators of the automated derivatives market, so he's kind of a big guy, writes an important essay on noise. And he says, the effects of noise on the world are profound. Noise makes trading in financial markets possible. It's exactly all that false information that lets us make money. It's the source of arbitrage. His famous article, Noise Trading, formalized a new discourse in finance and posited that we trade and profit from misinformation and information overload. By the 1980s, these ideas of network, stochastic, and population-based intelligences had transformed into literal technologies with the advent of things like the Black-Scholes derivative pricing equation. Options trading makes volatility and speculation and excess of information in the market the very site of extracting data. And ominously, so they're kind of bank in on all this volatility. And ominously, we might recall Hayek's original statements, the perception is a process dedicated to producing distinctions, which indeed financialization has done quite a good job of doing, or discriminations, if we look at how finance capital has created, obviously, separations in class and also race and everything else. We might now say that finance capital, those very constant differentiations, have become the very site, the infrastructure for speculation, and the goal is the ongoing kind of monetization of difference. Hayek himself espoused an imaginary about this data-rich world that would be increasingly calculated without human consciousness. He was very fond of quoting Alfred North Whitehead's remark that it is profoundly erroneous truism that we should cultivate the habit of thinking what we are doing. Civilization advances by extending the number of important operations we can perform without thinking about them. So the less thought, the better. So a curious and conflicting hope that technical decision-making made at the scale of populations, not through governments, might ameliorate all the errors of danger and errors of human judgment through automation, which is kind of where our technology sits in. Ironically, however, the very problems of false patterns, delusions, and noise that threaten the stability of such self-organizing systems were the grounds not for an elimination of or a return to reasonable governance, but rather a turn to computation. So the neoliberal demand is that rather than safeguard networks by perhaps fostering different types of systems or diversity of systems, the state separated from the economy or psychology separated from computing, this crisis in fact drove for an increased assimilation of more territory into calculation. More data, maybe even more noise was the answer. The less that enters conscious, the more operations that can be made without thought, supposedly the better. Thus the emergence of computationally driven markets through technologies like derivative pricing, and more terrifyingly perhaps the increased understanding that to manage systems means offering more freedom to execute individual market decisions, a freedom now incorporated into our network systems, environments, and landscapes. So this returns me to the present, and I'm going to end really soon. If Hayek and Hebb still worried about liberal subjects and objectivity, we might ask, what concerns animate our contemporary networks? Markets and now reactionary politics seek instability and discrimination, but without diversity. Shock has been normalized to be managed through our electronic networks. Networks that ironically appear to have the power to exacerbate fantasies of individual control and paranoid imaginaries of agential patterns. If shock for Naomi Klein was a mechanism to destabilize systems and nations to allow the entry of neoliberal governance, we might extend her observation to recognize that now it has become a tool for maintaining existing neoliberal systems and to encourage the growth and proliferation of machine learning networks and algorithmic finance. But we do not need to give up. We should not bequeath the power that has also been given from our machines. The apparatus of the epistemology of the neural net has opened to both positive potentials, neurodiversity, plasticity, and new forms of collectivity that so many people have discussed, even as enhanced financialization of life and the necropolitics of neoliberal economics. As cultural theorist Randy Martin has argued, rather than separating itself from social processes of production and reproduction, algorithmic finance actually demonstrates the increased interrelatedness, globalization, and socialization of debt and precarity. So like in 2008, like middle-class homeowners groups suddenly found themselves in the same case as lower class people given bad mortgages. Is there something that can happen with a sort of increased indebtedness that our networks also create between us, right? Hayek himself gestured to this possibility in his own thought. Markets, he argued, demand difference. From the fact that people are very different, the result must be inequality, and that in their actual position, and that the only way to place them in equal positions would be to treat them differently. So we have to treat people in a situated way. Equality before the law and material equality are therefore not only different, but in conflict with each other, and we cannot achieve either one or the other, but not both at the same time. With these worlds, he stated the fundamental dilemma of neoliberalism. To be free, we must be put in relationship to each other. But he also wavers. Does liberty denote equal treatment and therefore a generic law, or differential and situated treatment, which might denote planning or some sort of socialized intervention? The response of neoliberal discourse has been to automate this relationship, thus obscuring its social character, and extract value from the differences between human beings while maintaining that such relations emerge evolutionarily and thus are non-intentional but natural and necessary. But might this discourse be disrupted somehow? Without defense of Hayek, I seek to find those moments not only without but within the epistemology of neoliberalisms, where coherence cracks and the recognition of difference enters. But unlike Hayek, I would not say the law is at odds with materiality or well-being, but that the two are mutually constituted. The neoliberal trick is to turn civil rights into algorithms and to evade situating and historicizing the relationships that make our world. If difference is the platform for our present technology, then we must activate that fact. The future, I argue, lies in recognizing what our machines have finally made visible, what has perhaps always been there, mainly the social political nature of our seemingly techno-natural thoughts and perceptions. And that all computer systems are programmed and therefore planned, we are also forced to contend with the intentional and therefore changeable nature of how we both think and imagine our world. Thank you.